Hello and welcome to Lesson 2 of the Advanced Music Theory course on Fundamental Harmony. In this lesson we will be looking at triads, inversions and figured bass. So I would recommend, if you don't fully understand everything about key signatures, scales and intervals, that you go back to Lesson 1 and make sure that you revise it. And if you have any questions, again, you can always ask, get in contact with me or arrange an appointment. But please make sure you understand everything from Lesson 1 first before moving on to this lesson. So there's just one thing I want to go over again from lesson 1, and that was scale degrees. As you should already know, each note in any scale is a degree, and degrees can be described using the numeric scale degree notation to reflect their positions in the scale. We've already seen this in the case of C major. Okay, so as you can see, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth degrees, they've all got that symbol above each number, and you're talking about the individual scale degrees. Okay, so it's important that you're familiar with that way of notating scale degrees. And again, each degree in any scale also has a special name to reflect its importance and function within the scale. So this is just the same information that we already looked at in lesson 1. You should remember that the first degree of the scale is called the tonic, the second degree is the supertonic, the third is the mediant, fourth is the subdominant, the fifth is the dominant, the sixth is the submediant, and the seventh is the leading note. And again, when you go back to the eighth degree or the first degree of the scale, you're back to the tonic. Okay, so it's important that you understand this part of lesson 1 in particular, because we're going to be looking at it now in terms of triads and chords. Okay, so you need to be familiar with these terms. So what is a triad? Well, as the name suggests, a triad is a group of 3 notes which are played together. So just like a triangle has 3 sides or 3 angles, a triad has 3 notes that are played together. Okay, so we're literally just moving beyond the harmonic intervals of the first lesson, in which we had 2 notes that were played together. A triad is now the next most simple type of harmony, and that's 3 notes played together. So triads are the basis, the foundation for most harmony that we'll be looking at in this course. All triads are formed in the same way. Okay, so the first note is the note the triad is based on. That's called the root. Okay, as you can see it there, it's the note at the bottom of that triad. The second note is a third above the root. Okay, so the second note's always a third above it. And the third note is a fifth above the root. Okay, so it's basically your root, your third, and your fifth. Okay, and all triads are formed that way. So it's a note, skip a note, a note, skip a note, a note. So as you can see in that example, it's the spaces that have notes and the lines don't have notes. Okay, but it can be based, the root can be based on a line, in which case you're going to be using the lines and missing the spaces. So triads are basically a note, skip a note, skip a note, and then the note again. Or if you want to think of it just in terms of the root, third, and fifth. Okay, the root, third above the root, and the fifth above the root, and all triads are formed this way. It's very important to remember that. So triads can be built on any degree of any scale. And we're going to look at the triads in the scale of C major. Okay, so these are all the triads that are based on the scale of C major, on each degree of the scale of C major. So you can see that at the bottom of each triad is the scale of C major, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, for all 8 of those triads. And the names that we give these triads, they come from the degrees of the scale in which they are based. So the triad on the tonic is called the tonic triad, the triad on the dominant is the dominant triad, and so on and so on. So these are the Roman numerals that we use to describe each of these triads. So I'll come to why some of them are capital and some of them are lowercase. We'll explain that in the next slide. But what's important to remember now is that the tonic degree of the scale with a triad above it is called the tonic triad. Likewise for the supertonic triad, and the third one would be the mediant triad, and then the fourth would be the subdominant triad, followed by the dominant triad, and then the submediant triad, and the leading note triad, and back to the tonic triad. So you can see that it's exactly the same descriptions, exactly the same terms we use when talking about triads that we were already using for the degrees of the scale from the previous lesson. So you need to be very familiar of tonic, supertonic, median, subdominant, dominant, submediant, leading note, and tonic again, because you're probably going to be using these terms for every single lesson between now and the final lesson. So it's important to be familiar with them and the order in which they come. So we use the Roman numerals for harmony chords. As you can see, the dominant triad, I use a capital V for the dominant triad. But when we're using the numeric scale degree notation for when we're describing individual melodic notes, we use that 5 with the little symbol above the 5, and that describes the 5th note of the scale. Okay, so we use Roman numerals for chords and triads, for harmony basically, and we use the numeric scale degree notation when talking about individual notes or the melody. Okay. So let's look now at triads in major keys. The very first thing you need to know about triads is that, like intervals, they can be major, minor, diminished, or augmented. So it's very important that you understand intervals at this point, because the only way you're going to know if a triad is major, minor, diminished, or augmented is by knowing your intervals back to front. Okay, so you really need to go back over lesson 1 and go over intervals if you don't understand them fully at this point. So major triads consist of a major third and a perfect fifth. And in major keys, your major triads will be your tonic triad, your subdominant triad, and your dominant triad, or triad 1, 4, and 5. Okay, so in the key of C major, I've given you those triads. So the distance in the tonic triad between the C and the E is a major third, and between the C and the G is a perfect fifth. In the subdominant triad, the distance between the F and the A is a major third, and the F and the C is a perfect fifth. And in the dominant triad, the distance between the G and the B is a major third, and the distance between the G and the D is a perfect fifth. So that's what makes them major triads. But just because you're in a major key doesn't mean that all your triads are going to be major. I know that sounds strange, but if you're playing a piece in a major key, not every single triad or every single chord you're going to play is going to be a major chord. For variety, you will have minor chords in there, diminished chords, maybe even augmented chords. So there are minor triads you need to know, even if you're in a major key. In all major keys, the minor triads consist of a minor third and a perfect fifth, and they're going to be your chords, or sorry, your triads on the supertonic, the mediant, and the submediant, or triads 2, 3, and 6. So in the key of C major, I've written them out for you, and you should be able to see, if you understand intervals fully at this point, for the supertonic triad, you should be able to see that the distance between the D and the F is a minor third, and the distance between the D and the A is a perfect fifth. For the mediant triad, the distance between the E and the G is a minor third, and the distance between the E and the B is a perfect fifth. And for the submediant triad, the distance between the A and the C is a minor third, and the distance between the A and the E is a perfect fifth. So that's what makes them minor triads, is that the distance from the roots of each of those triads to the thirds of each of those triads, the distance is a minor third. Okay, so in major triads, the distance between your root and your third is a major third, but in minor triads, the distance between your root and your third is a minor third. There is one more triad which you need to know in major keys, and that is your diminished triad. They consist of a minor third and a diminished fifth, and in all major keys this is going to occur on your leading note triad. So in the key of C major, which I've given you the leading note triad for, you can see that the distance between the root and the third, or the B and the D, is a minor third, and the distance between the root and the fifth, or the B and the F, is a diminished fifth. So hopefully at this point you'll be able to see that there is a different way for writing Roman numerals depending on whether or not the triad is major, minor, or diminished. For all major triads, the Roman numerals are capital, okay, or uppercase. So you always write your Roman numerals as capitals for major triads. For minor triads, your Roman numerals are always going to be lowercase. Okay, so just remember that's why they're written lowercase. It's just to show that, or just to differentiate them between major triads and minor triads. And for diminished triads, they're also lowercase, but you have that, see that wee symbol next to the Roman numeral in the leading note triad there? That little circle that you put, that just distinguishes it from minor triads, because minor triads are also lowercase Roman numerals. So the way that I remember it is, if it's capital, that means that if it's a capital Roman numeral, that means that it's a major third and a perfect fifth. If it's lowercase, that means it's a minor third and a perfect fifth. And if it's lowercase with that little symbol next to it, that means it's a minor third and a diminished fifth. So let's look now at triads in minor keys. It's a little bit more difficult to understand triads in minor keys, because in minor keys there are two possible triads for each degree, except for the first degree. Because you have harmonic minors and melodic minors, you're going to get two different types of triads for each degree of the scale, except for the tonic triad. So we're going to take C harmonic minor. So if you remember that C minor will have 3 flats in its key signature, but the harmonic minor scale will also have a raised 7th, a B natural, ascending and descending. But the C melodic minor will have a raised 6th and 7th ascending, so an A natural and a B natural, which will return to normal, A flat and B flat, when they descend. Okay, so because you have two different types of minor scale, you're going to have various triads to deal with in minor keys. So I've just taken from the tonic triad up to the subdominant there. So we're still in the key of C minor, but you should be able to see that the tonic triad in C minor is C, E flat and G, and that's the only type of triad that you have for the tonic. But for the supertonic, you can see it can either be a diminished triad or a minor triad, excuse me, depending on whether or not you have that A natural. For the median triad, you also have a major triad or an augmented triad, depending on whether or not you have that B natural. And for the subdominant triad, it can either be minor or major, depending again whether or not you have that A natural. So if you look above at the C harmonic minor scale has a B natural, and the C melodic minor has an A natural and B natural, when you put those A naturals and B naturals throughout your triads, you can see that depending on whether or not you're using the harmonic or melodic minor scale, you can have different triads. That's why minors are a little bit more difficult. You don't have to memorize all of these, but you just have to be aware that if you're going to analyze a piece of music that's in a minor key, all the triads or chords you're dealing with, there could be many different types that you may have to be familiar with. So as you can see there, just between the tonic and the subdominant triad, just the first 4 degrees of the scale, you have minors, diminished, majors, and augmented. Okay, so loads of all different types of triads. And just to continue on with that, here we have the dominant triad up to the leading note triad, and again each one there's 2 different types you can have depending on whether or not you're using the melodic or harmonic minor scale. So the dominant triad can be minor or major. It's usually major because of that B natural, the raised 7th. It's very rare you're going to come across a minor dominant chord in a minor piece. Usually the major dominant triad is the most popular. Likewise for the submediant triad, the next one, you can either have it as major or diminished, but the major one is more common. And likewise for the very last one, the leading note triad, it can be major or diminished, but the diminished one is probably more common. So we're just going to look at the harmonic minor triads in a wee bit more detail, just because they're probably more popular than the melodic minor ones. Again, we're going to be dealing with fundamental harmony, so as the name suggests, harmonic minor triads are probably more common than the melodic minor triads. So the major triads, as we know from the major key triads, major triads consist of a major third and a perfect fifth. And in the key of C minor, major triads are usually going to occur on your dominant and your submediant triads, or on your fifth and sixth chords. Because you have the raised seventh on the dominant triad, that's what makes it a major triad. It gives it that major quality. And also the sub-mediant triad, it was actually minor when we were in major keys, and this time it's major when we're in a minor key. So those are the two most common major triads that you're going to have in most of your harmonies, in minor keys anyway. And minor triads, as we know from before, consist of a minor third and a perfect fifth, and in your minor keys these tend to occur on your tonic and subdominant triads. In the key of C minor, I've written them out here. You've got a C, E flat and G, and an F, A flat and C. Okay, so that's what makes them minor, is that minor third between C and E flat and between F and A flat. So that's where you would usually find your minor triads in minor keys, on the tonic and the subdominant. Diminished triads, again as we know from before, consist of a minor third and a diminished fifth. And in minor keys, not only does it occur on the leading note triad as it does in major keys, but it also occurs on the supertonic as well. So on chord 2 triad 2 and 7, or chords 2 and 7. And in the minor key, you can see there between D and F is a minor third, and between D and A flat is a diminished fifth. That takes care of your supertonic triad. And in your leading note triad, between B and D is a minor third, and between B and F is a diminished fifth, and that's your leading note triad. And your final triad for the harmonic minor triads is an augmented triad, and it consists of a major third and an augmented fifth. And in the key of C minor, if you're using your harmonic minor triads, that will occur on your mediant triad. Between E flat and G is a major third, and between E flat and B natural is an augmented fifth. You may not come across this triad all that much. Augmented triads tend not to be used by composers because they're quite harsh sounding, they're quite dissonant. So in classical, baroque and even earlier music, it's quite rare to come across an augmented triad, but maybe in the late romantic and 20th century music it's more popular. So it's rare that you use the harmonic minor form for your mediant triads, because it means that you're going to make the mediant triad augmented, and it doesn't sound that good. Also notice that we have a new symbol for augmented triads. It's a plus sign, and it's next to capital Roman numerals. So for major triads, they're capital Roman numerals. For minor triads, they're lowercase Roman numerals. For diminished triads, they're lowercase Roman numerals, but with the circle symbol next to them, just to distinguish them from minor triads. And the augmented triads are capital Roman numerals, but with the augmented symbol, which is that plus sign next to them, and that just distinguishes them from major triads because they're also capital Roman numerals. So you should be familiar with these different ways of writing down the Roman numeral system. Depending on what triad, the quality of the triad you're working with, it's going to be quite different Roman numerals you're going to be using. And here's just a summary of the triad descriptions that we've come across so far. Again, augmented triad, it has a major third and an augmented fifth, and the abbreviation symbol that you use for that's the plus sign. And I've just given you an example there on the C with an E and a G sharp at the top. Between C and E is a major third, and between C and G sharp is an augmented fifth, so that's an augmented chord. Major triads, you have a major third and a perfect fifth, and the abbreviation for that would be just a capital M. And we've come across that before as well. So between C and E is a major third, and between C and G this time is a perfect fifth. And in minor triads, you have a minor third and a perfect fifth, and the abbreviation for that is a lowercase m. And again, I've just started on C just to show you the difference between all the chords that you can have on C. So between C and E flat's a minor third, and between C and G is still a perfect fifth. And in the last one, for diminished chords or diminished triads, you have a minor third and a diminished fifth, and the symbol for that's the little circle, and that would be a minor third between C and E flat and a diminished fifth between C and G flat. So that's just a summary of all the triad descriptions that we've come across so far. Also, there's something else we need to know about triads and chords when we come across chords in a minute. They can be in open and closed positions. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean when I say a chord is an open or closed position? When a chord or a triad is played, its notes as close together as possible, it is described as being in closed position. So for example, that's a closed position triad or closed position chord right there. Your your G, B, and D are as close together as is possible. But when a chord or a triad is played with its notes spaced apart, then it's described as being in open position. This is far more popular, especially if you're doing pop music or jazz music. It's very rare that you're going to be playing all those chords in the middle of the piano quite close together. You tend to space everything out, especially in your left hand. So this is more popular, but you have to recognize both positions. Okay, so that's what open position would look like. You can see that between your G and your D there's no B, so there's a bit of a gap, there's a space there, and also between D and B there's a gap, and there's a space there as well. So hopefully you're able to see the difference between open and closed positions. Closed position is probably more appropriate when you're discussing music theoretically, when you're giving musical examples. Probably so far a lot of the triads I've shown you are all in closed position. Just makes it easier to read, but in reality when you're playing these chords you tend to space them out. So you can have a triad like their GBD, that is your triad, but the one beneath it is also GBD, but they're just not in that order. It's just the notes are spaced out. It just fills out the thickness, the texture of the chord a bit better. And inversions is something else that we need to cover as well. What do I mean by inversions? Well, so far we've seen root position actually. It's one of the common positions that you have for triads and chords, and that's when you have the root at the bottom. And I've just given you an example here with the F triad with the notes F, A, and C. You have your root at the bottom, which is your F. You have your third above F, and you have your fifth above F. So you have your root, third, and fifth. And that's called a root position triad because the root is at the bottom. So remember, the bass is very, very important when we're dealing with harmony. When you're dealing with the quality of a chord or its inversion, you're usually measuring from the bottom note up. Okay. So depending on what note is at the bottom will depend on what type of inversion you're dealing with. So a triad can also have the third at the bottom, and this is called first inversion. So in the F triad, this would be the A at the bottom with the C and F somewhere else above it. So there's your third at the bottom, there's your fifth C, and now your roots at the top. It's important to notice, I haven't put it in this slide, but it's important to note that the third is at the bottom. The root and the fifth can be anywhere above it. Okay, they don't have to be, the fifth doesn't have to be the next note above the third, and the root doesn't have to be at the very top. It can be the other way around. You can have the fifth above the root. Okay, so it just means that as long as the third is at the bottom, the root and the fifth can be anywhere else. So imagine you're looking at an orchestral score of a symphony or something like that, and it's probably rare that you come across this, but just imagine that the entire orchestra is playing a triad. If the double bass at the bottom is playing the third, regardless of where all the other roots and fifths amongst all the other instruments are located, it's going to be a first inversion triad. Okay, because the root is at the bottom of the score. The root is played as the lowest note. That's all you need, is the lowest note to be the third, and then the root and the fifth can be anywhere else. It doesn't have to be the order I've shown here. I've only put them in this order to make it easier to read. So bear that in mind. As long as the third is at the bottom, you can have the root and the fifth anywhere else above it. And then of course you have one more inversion. A triad can also have the fifth at the bottom, and this is called second inversion. So again, just to use the F triad for familiarity, this would be the C at the bottom with the F and A somewhere else above it. So there you can see your C is your fifth, and that's at the bottom of the triad, followed by the root and the third, and again that root and the third can be anywhere above that fifth. Just as long as the fifth is at the bottom, that's what makes it second inversion. Okay, so those are the three most common types of positions that you'd have for triads. You have root position, first inversion, and second inversion. Root position with the root at the bottom, first inversion with the third at the bottom, and second inversion with the fifth at the bottom. So when using Roman numerals to denote triads, it's also possible to use small letters like A, B, and C to indicate root position, first inversion, and second inversion respectively. I'm going to take a couple of examples, and again I'll probably just stick to C major to make it easier to read. So say for example we come across this symbol, Roman numeral 5 with a B next to it. That means it's the first inversion of the dominant triad. Okay, so let's take an example in C major. Your dominant triad, V, is equal to GBD in the key of C major. So count 5 up from C, C, D, E, F, G. Form a triad on that G, G, B, D. And then if you were to have a B next to that V symbol, that means that you're saying it's first inversion dominant triad. So the B is going to be at the bottom. And I've just given you the example there. There's your third at the bottom, there's your followed by your fifth and your root. So you could describe that as 5B in the key of C major. Okay. Also, there's the other example, just I'm going to do second inversion as well and keep it in the key of C major, just change the chord. I'm using the subdominant chord this time and I have a C next to the Roman numerals for 4. And that means it's a second inversion of the subdominant triad. So in the key of C major, your subdominant triad is your fourth triad, so count 4 up from C, C, D, E, F. Form a triad on that F, F, A, C. And then if you have a C next to that description, that means that you're saying it's a second inversion, subdominant triad. So the C is going to be at the bottom. So the C's at the bottom, which is the fifth of the triad, followed by the root and the third. So you can use those letters A, B, and C to describe if it's in root position for A, or if it's in first inversion for B, or if it's in second inversion for C. So you're just getting more detail in your analysis and your descriptions of triads and chords. So you're using the Roman numeral system and then you're just adding an A, B, or C next to those Roman numerals to say whether or not the triad is in root position, first inversion, and second inversion. So I think it's a good point now to come on to chords. So what are chords? Well, a chord is usually 3 or more notes that are sounded together. So a triad is one of the basic types of chord that we can have. A triad is a special type of chord in that we'll have the 3 notes in a triad, as the name suggests. But you can make a triad a fuller sounding chord by doubling any of the notes that make up the triad. It's usually the root. So for example, the triad FAC, you can double the root, so you have FACF, so there's a fuller sounding chord. You have the F at the bottom, followed by the A above it, and the C above it, and the F at the top. Okay, so you play that together as a chord, or if you were to break those notes up, it would be your arpeggio, I suppose, on F. So you can see that's an F chord, and it's in root position because the root's at the bottom. You can also double the fifth as well, so you can have C at the bottom, for example, followed by an F, an A, and another C at the top. So the C's doubled this time, and that would be a second inversion there because you have the C at the bottom. And you can also double the third as well of a chord, so you have 2 A's. In other words, you have an A at the bottom, followed by the C, followed by the F, followed by another A, the third doubled. Okay, so they're all F chords, but I've just doubled different notes for each one. Doubling the third rarely happens because it doesn't actually sound as good as the other two above. The most common note to double to create a chord out of a triad, the most common note to double is the root. Okay, followed by the fifth occasionally, and very, very rarely doubling the third. We'll come across that later on when we're dealing with voice leading about which notes to double, because when you're writing for 4 voices, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, you have to actually double a note for one of the chords that you're dealing with, unless you're using 7th chords and things like that. So we'll come across that later about what notes are best to double and when it is best to double certain notes. Notice also that they are always called the root, the third, and the fifth, even if they are inverted or appear in a different octave. Okay, so you always call that F the root, even if it's not actually at the bottom, if it's not the root of the chord. Okay, so you still call them the root, the third, and the fifth notes, regardless of what inversion you're using. So let's come on to seventh chords now. This is probably the most common type of chord after just doubling a note from a triad. Seventh chords are very popular in music. So far, all the triads and chords we have seen have used the basic intervals which make up a triad in chords, in other words, the root, the third, and the fifth, and one or more of these notes doubled. But you can get more elaborate chords, and they're made up using not only the root, the third, and the fifth, but also the seventh. And if you have the seventh in a chord, it's a seventh chord. Just to give you an example, here's G, the note G, form a triad on G and you get G, B, D. And that's your root, third, and fifth. And then you can add a seventh above it. That's your F. So you have the root, third, fifth, and the seventh. And you can see what that looks like in the treble clef of your G, B, D, and F. So that's a seventh chord. You have your G as your root, your B as your third, your D as your fifth, and your F as your seventh. Okay. So that does something to chords when you add a seventh onto it like that, because it means there's another possible inversion, third inversion, in which the seventh of the chord is now at the bottom. So you can have root position, first inversion, second inversion as we've already seen, and then third inversion with the seventh at the bottom. So let's take an example of that. Well, let's keep it in C major. So say you're in the key of C major. Your dominant triad is your GBD, the root, third, and fifth. If you add the F on the top, you've got the root, third, fifth, and seventh, and then you put the F down at the bottom, and that's your seventh, root, third, and fifth. And the symbol that you use, or the letter that you now use for that, is a D. Okay, so A would signify root position, B signifies first inversion, C signifies second inversion, and D would signify third inversion. And you can see that in the example in the treble clef there. You have your F at the bottom, your G followed by the G, which is the root of the chord, and then your B, which is your third, and then your D, which is your fifth. So now that we have a seventh on top of your triad, or to make a more fuller sounding chord, your summary of seventh chord descriptions, there's going to be quite a few new things to take on board now. So let's look at what a major seventh chord will look like. A major seventh chord will have a major triad, in other words a major third and a perfect fifth involved in it, and then a major seventh interval on top of that, and the abbreviation for that is a capital M with a 7 next to it. And I've given you an example starting on C. They're all starting on C just so you can compare them. So the C, the E, the G, and the B, the distance between the C and the E is a major third, and the distance between the C and the G is a perfect fifth. So there's your major triad there. And then you've added a major seventh on top of that. So the distance between C and B, or the interval between C and B, is a major seventh. So that's a major seventh chord, and we use the abbreviation capital M with a 7 next to it to signify that. You can also have what we call a major minor seventh chord. I know that sounds strange, but it is possible, and they're quite common. And that's made up of a major triad with a minor seventh on top of that, and that's written as a capital M, lowercase m, and a 7. So major minor seventh chord. And just to show you the example there, that's the interval between C and E is a major third, between C and G is a perfect fifth, so there's your major triad, and then between C and B flat is your minor seventh. Okay, so that's probably that's even more popular than just your major seventh chord. Major minor seventh chords are very popular, in fact. You can also just have your normal minor seventh chord, in which case you have a minor triad followed by a minor seventh on top of it, and that's written as a lowercase m with a 7. That's the abbreviation you use. And just to look at the example again, between C and E flat is a minor third, and between C and G is a perfect fifth, so that's your minor triad there. And then you've added a minor seventh on top of it with a B flat again. And then we come across a couple of weird things that happen when you use seventh chords. You have half diminished and fully diminished chords, and this is an area that students find quite difficult to understand when they first come across it. It's an area of great confusion. It's probably best to take them individually. Half diminished seventh chords are quite common actually. It's made up of a diminished triad with a minor seventh on top of it. And that's written as the little circle symbol that we've already come across, but with a line through it, and the 7 to signify seventh chords. So it's made up of a diminished triad, so between C and E flat's your minor third, and between C and G flat is your diminished fifth, so there's your diminished triad in there. And then you have a C and a B flat at the top, and that's a minor seventh. So that's why it's a half diminished seventh chord, because only part of the chord is diminished, but the other part is minor. So between C and between your root and your fifth is diminished, but between your root and your seventh is minor. So that's why it's only half diminished, and you have to put a line through that circle to signify that. A fully diminished seventh chord, on the other hand, has a diminished triad and a diminished seventh on top of it. So it's a fully diminished seventh chord, and they're very popular. We'll come across a couple of examples of them later. But for now, just if you're get used to the theory of it, it's made up of a diminished triad and a diminished seventh on top. So between C and D flat is a minor third, and between C and G flat is a perfect fifth. So there's your diminished triad. And then you have a diminished seventh on top of that, which is between C and B double flat. Okay. So again, you should be familiar with double flats and everything from the other course, the basic music theory course. So if you're unsure of these terms, I would advise you to go back over and look over the basic music theory course. So for double flats and double sharps and things like that, you should already have come across them anyway when you're dealing, especially with double sharps, when you're dealing with minor scales and things like that. So yes, that's a fully diminished seventh chord made up of a diminished triad and a diminished seventh. So pay close attention when you're looking at seventh chords, that there are many possibilities for seventh chords. There's over 5 possibilities there, and 2 of them are very similar, half diminished and fully diminished. I usually remember the difference between half diminished and fully diminished, in that if the distance between the top note, the bottom note and the top note is minor, then it's a half diminished chord, and between the bottom note and the top note, if it's diminished, then it's a fully diminished chord. But just go back and double check to make sure that the inner intervals as well between your root and your fifth is also diminished. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense about all the different types of seventh chords you can have. Again, we're just going to quickly go through the frequency of these seventh chords. You don't have to memorize this. This is just a handy table to show you what are the most common seventh chords you're ever going to come across. So we'll just go through it by each scale degree. So we'll deal with the tonic first. In major keys, obviously it's a capital Roman numeral, and in minor keys it's a lowercase Roman numeral, but both of them will have the seventh next to it. As you can see, I've said they're not at all common, though occasionally occur, and when they do occur, they're almost always in root position, so they're not that common. Supertonic seventh chords, very common, almost always in first inversion, so it's very common to have supertonic seventh chords in major keys and minor keys. And as you can see, if you have it in a minor key, it's going to be a half diminished seventh chord, whereas in a major key it's just a minor seventh chord. Okay, so look out for that. In the mediant, very rare to have this type of chord. Lowercase Roman numerals for major, capital for minor chords or minor keys, and they're both seventh chords, so you both need to write 7 next to each Roman numeral. But they're very rare. It's very rare you're going to come across this. In fact, mediant chords are rare themselves, and to have a seventh on top of it makes it even more of a strange sounding chord. So it's very rare you're going to come across a mediant seventh chord in a Bach chorale. Okay, and they'll be like hen's teeth. If you come across it, let me know. For subdominant triads, or sorry, subdominant seventh chords, again, not all that common. It's going to be a major seventh chord in major keys and a minor seventh chord in minor keys, your subdominant chords. Not all that common, although they occasionally occur and almost always in root position. And now we come across probably the most common seventh chord you're ever going to need to know for major keys and minor keys, and that's the dominant seventh. It's very common, and it's usually major in minor keys as well, and it's obviously major in major keys. It's the most popular seventh chord because it actually defines what key you're in. The dominant seventh chord will have a very, very strong pull back to your tonic chord. We'll deal with that later when we're dealing with chord progressions, so just be aware for now that dominant 7th chords are very, very common. Submediant 7th chords, not all that common, although they occasionally occur, and again almost always in root position. Be careful again that it's a minor submediant chord in major keys and it's a major submediant chord in minor keys. The subtonic chord is a special type of chord that I'll go into in more detail, and it's common in minor keys, and it actually sounds like the 5/7 of the relative major. So we're going to come across that quite far on in the course, the subtonic chord, and with a 7th on top of it. So you don't have to know it just yet, but I'm just including it here just to be comprehensive with all the 7th chords. So you don't have to know about it just yet. The leading note chord with a 7th above it, as you can see, it's different depending on whether or not you're in a major key or a minor key. It's half diminished, the leading note 7th chord, in major keys, and it's fully diminished, the leading note 7th chord, in minor keys. So although the leading note half diminished 7th chord is not unheard of, it's not as strong, and it's often replaced by that leading note fully diminished 7th chord. So you can see the difference between whether you're major or minor, you're dealing with half diminished or fully diminished. So they are probably more common than things like, the mediant 7th chords, or even the subdominant 7th chords or the submediant 7th chord. So they're actually not unheard of. But by far the most common ones you're going to need to know are on the supertonic and the dominant. Those are the two most common 7th chords that we're going to come across. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that 99.9% of the time when you're coming across the 7th chord, it's going to be on the supertonic or the dominant. Okay, but just so you know that it is possible to have 7th chords elsewhere on your scale. You can have it in your tonic or your mediant or your subdominant or your submediant or on your leading note. It is possible. But I would say that the dominant 7th is the most common, followed by the supertonic 7th, probably followed by the leading note 7th, probably followed by the submediant and subdominant, and probably then the tonic, and then the rarest of them all would be the mediant. Okay, I don't think you should ever really come across that. If you find that you're composing your own 4-part harmony in the style of a Bach chorale and you've used a mediant 7th chord, I would strongly recommend you change it to something else, because it's not a great sounding chord and they're very, very rare. So now we come to figured bass, and this is probably the section that will be newest to most musicians. It's not really taught so much anymore as it was in the past, but it's a great tool to use, especially in analysis, and it was very popular in the Baroque period for indicating how chords are played, and it fell out of favour towards the classical and definitely into the Romantic period. It wasn't used as much, but it's still used as a great teaching tool for analysis, figured bass. I'm just going to show you an example of what it looks like. So the thing to pay attention to here will be the Roman numerals underneath the chords. So the analysis section is what we're looking at, and you should already be familiar with these Roman numerals, but the numeric symbols next to those Roman numerals, that's the figured bass. Okay, so things like the dominant chord with the 7th, the tonic chord with the 6th, the subdominant chord with the 6th, and the dominant chord with the 6/5 next to it. So those are all examples of figured bass, and I'll go through and explain what they mean in the next slide, but it's just important to know that it's a great tool to use, especially when you're analysing a 4-part writing with soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So the Roman numerals indicate the degree in which the chord is built, but the figured bass indicates the position of the chord, in other words, how it's played. So Roman numerals will tell you what the chord is in relation to the key and to your tonic, in other words. So is it chord 5 or chord 2 or chord 1, whatever. But figured bass will actually tell you how that chord is played, and when you combine them both together, Roman numerals and figured bass, in your analysis, you get a very powerful analytical tool. It's used in a lot of theory books and a lot of course books. So if you're able to understand and read through Roman numerals with figured bass, you get a very good idea of how the music is going to sound and how to analyze music. So what is figured bass? Well, I've just explained a wee bit about it, but I'll go into more detail now. Figured bass is just basically a system of describing a chord above a given bass note. Okay, so the numbers in the figured bass refer to the diatonic intervals above that bass note in accordance with the key signature. So here's an example of a G triad, G note with a triad belt above it, so you have a GBD chord. And before we would have said this was a root position chord, and you could have used the A to indicate that next to your Roman numeral. So say this was in the key of C major, this would be a chord 5A. With a Roman numeral for 5, the V, and the A next to it. But in figured bass, it's a bit more detailed than that. If you actually look at the individual intervals between each note, the distance between the G and the B is a third, and the distance between the G and the D is a fifth. So the figured bass for this is actually 5/3. So if you were in the key of C major, this would be a Roman numeral V for 5, and then you could write next to that Roman numeral 5/3, indicating that the chord is actually played with the G at the bottom in root position, in other words. In fact, these chords are so common, root position chords are so common in figure bass and in all music, that usually when you're writing an analysis of a piece of music and you're writing your Roman numerals, you actually don't even have to write 5/3 next to it. And the same if you were doing the old system of just putting an A next to the Roman numeral, you wouldn't even have to put that A next to the Roman numeral because they're so common. So the figure bass abbreviation for 5/3 is actually just to put nothing down. So if this was a GBD chord in the key of C major, you would just put, for your analysis, this is chord 5, and then leave it blank. You can put in 5/3 next to it if you like, but it's probably more common just to leave it completely blank. So first inversion, as we've already seen, that was when you put a B next to the Roman numeral to indicate that the third is now in the bass. But again, if you want to just analyze it using figured bass is better because it's more detailed. And just look at the individual intervals within this chord or within this triad, and you'll see that the distance between the B and the D is a third. But now the distance between the B and the top note, in other words the B and the G, is a sixth. So in figured bass terminology, this would be a 6/3 chord. So it's just the same as in the past as saying, again, if we were in the key of C major, this is your GBD triad, but in first inversion, you would say it was a chord 5, Roman numeral 5, V, with a B next to it. But you could also write Roman numeral 5 with a 6/3 next to it. Okay, to indicate first inversion, and that's what we're teaching you in this course. We want you to use the figured bass rather than just using the A, B, and C and D to indicate root position, first inversion, second inversion, and third inversion. We want you to start getting used to the figured bass way of doing it because it's a lot more detailed, and that's usually abbreviated to just 6 because they're quite popular. You don't really have to write the 3. Okay, so you can just write a chord 5 for GBD in the key of C major, and then next to that Roman numeral 5, you write a 6. For second inversion, as we've already seen, that's when you can write C next to the Roman numeral. So again, this is a GBD chord, and if you're in the key of C major, this would be the dominant chord, so chord 5, Roman numeral V, and you could put a C next to it to indicate that it's in second inversion. But to look at the figured bass analysis of it, that is now the distance between the bottom note and the next note is a fourth, between the D and the G is a fourth, and between the D and the B is a sixth. So that in figured bass terminology would be a 6/4 chord. Okay, so that's your second inversion. 6/4 indicates second inversion, 6/3 indicates first inversion, and 5/3 indicates root position. But again, you can't really abbreviate 6/4 to 6 because that's what is used for first inversion. So unfortunately, you always have to write out 6/4, always has to be written out in full. So second inversion chords, if you're writing your Roman numeral analysis and then putting your figured bass analysis next to it, you always have to write out 6/4 in its entirety, just to distinguish it from first inversion. Okay, so figured bass then is just used as a tool to analyze how chords are played and what inversion they're played. So this is an important point to remember about figured bass. The figured bass stays the same regardless of which triad is being described. So here in the key of C major, this is how each triad and each position would be analysed. Sorry, it looks a wee bit squished. It's just tried to fit every single possibility onto one slide. So you can see the tonic triads at the very beginning in the first bar. Chord 1, and you can write 5-3 next to it, or 6-3 next to it, or 6-4 next to it to indicate that the root's at the bottom, the third's at the bottom, or the fifth's at the bottom. Again for chord 2, exactly the same thing. 5-3 for root position, 6-3 for first inversion, 6-4 for second inversion. And the same for the mediant chord, the subdominant chord, the dominant, the submediant, and the leading note chord. So you can see that regardless of what chord you're using, the figured bass is always going to stay the same because the distance between those notes, or the intervals between those notes in each triad, is always going to be the same. So you can see that in chord 1, the tonic chord, the distance between that C and the E is a third, and the distance between the C and the G is a fifth. But look at the supertonic chord, the distance between the D and the F is also a third, and the distance between the D and the A is a fifth. So it doesn't change, it stays the same. The figured bass system stays the same no matter what chord you're using. And also it's important to note when you're using open chords with figured bass, given that all the positions in the chords below contain C in the bass, they can all be described as 1-5-3 chords, chord 1, 5, 3. So in other words, a chord 1 in root position. So if you look at all 4 chords, you'll see that the C is the lowest note in each one. So it doesn't matter what order the notes are above it, you can see that the notes change for each chord above that C, but they're all described as 1-5-3. Okay, so it's just because you've already got the C at the bottom, so regardless of what position you put the chords above that, doesn't change what overall position the chord is. Because the C's at the bottom, it's going to be root position. So if your E and G can be above it anywhere, as you can see. Now the same holds true for all chords in first inversion and second inversion. So again, just to show you that C, E, G chord, we'll take the first inversion first. The E is going to be at the bottom for first inversion. So in that first example, all the chords have an E at the bottom, so it doesn't really matter what position the notes above that are. It's not going to affect the description or the analysis of the chord. It's still going to be described as a 1-6-3 chord, a chord 1 with the 6-3 next to it. And the same for the second inversion. You can see at the bottom, chord 1 in second inversion is going to have G at the bottom. Okay, we're still in C major, so chord 1 with the G at the bottom for each of those chords, and again it doesn't matter what way the C and the E appear above that. Okay, so it's still described as just a chord 1, 6, 4. So the real fun of figured bass occurs when you're using seventh chords. There are a few new symbols and terms you have to learn in order to understand seventh chords in figured bass. So let's look at them in turn. Here is a root position chord. It's a G chord, G7th chord, sorry. So you have a G with the third above it, which is the B, the fifth above it, which is the D, and the seventh above it, which is the F. So just to analyse this using figured bass, the distance between the G and the B is a third. The distance between the G and the D is a fifth, and the distance between the G and the F is the seventh. And the figured bass terminology you would use to describe this chord is, yes, you've guessed it, 7-5-3. A little bit cumbersome to write that, so in figured bass you usually abbreviate that to just 7. Okay, so if you see like a chord 5, and this would be a chord 5-7 actually in C major, G, B, D, F chord, you would just have the Roman numeral for 5, which is your capital V, and then a 7 next to it, 5-7. Okay, so that's the abbreviation, and as you can see, we just dropped out the 5 and the 3, actually almost the same as root position, a root position triad, where you just drop out the 5 and 3, you just abbreviate it to nothing. Same thing here, you just drop out the 5 and the 3, and then all that's left is your 7. So, first inversion of a 7th chord, this is where it gets a little bit strange. The distance between the B and the D now is a third. The distance between the B and the F is a fifth, but the distance between the B and the G is a sixth. So that's known as a 6-5-3 chord. Okay, and we usually abbreviate that to 6-5. We can't abbreviate it to 6 because then we're just describing a first inversion triad. Okay, our first inversion chord. We're not describing a first inversion seventh chord. So if you want to describe a first inversion seventh chord, you have to write 6/5. Okay, so that distinguishes it from just an ordinary first inversion chord. And again, you don't need to write the 3 in. So it seems that 3 is the thing that you hardly need to write in figured bass. Second inversion. Again, just looking at it using figured bass, the distance between the D and the F is a third, the distance between the D and the G is a fourth, and the distance between the D and the B is a sixth. So this is called a 6/4/3 chord. So what do you think this would be abbreviated to? Well, it can't be abbreviated to 6. Again, as I've already said this, that your 6 stands for a first inversion chord, not a first inversion seventh chord, just a first inversion chord. You can't abbreviate it to 6/4 because that's a second inversion chord. So you'd abbreviate it to 4/3. So you drop out the 6 this time. So 4/3 stands for a seventh chord that's in second inversion. In other words, a seventh chord that has the fifth at the bottom. Okay, so the 7 stands for a root position seventh chord with the root at the bottom. 6/5 is a seventh chord with the third at the bottom, so in first inversion. And a seventh chord, 4/3, stands for a seventh chord that's in second inversion with the fifth at the bottom. And again, as you probably have already guessed, there is a third inversion because it's a seventh chord. It's possible to have the seventh at the bottom. So this is what the third inversion chord would look like. So as you can see, I needed to use quite a few ledger lines now. So between the F and the G, that is a second. Between the F and the B is a fourth. And between the F and the D is a sixth. Okay, so in figured bass that would be called a 6/4/2 chord. So how would you write it? How would you abbreviate it? Well, you can't write 6 because, again, as I've already said this actually, you can't write 6 because that means just a first inversion chord. You can't write 6/4 because that means a second inversion chord. So you'd have to write 4/2 for third inversion. There's almost a pattern, as you can see on the right column, the far right column, the figured bass abbreviation. The way that I remember it is 7 for root position, 6/5 for first inversion, 4/3 for second inversion, and 4/2 for third inversion. So it's almost going 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and almost down to 2. So you have 4/2 at the end. So it's almost just descending from 7. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 4, 2. Okay. So that's all the figured bass that you're going to ever need to know in this course, really. There are other figured bass tools that we use, but we're not going to go into them in this course because this takes care of by far the most analysis tools that you're going to need for figured bass. So if you memorize all the figured bass just for ordinary chords, ordinary triads, and memorize all these ones for seventh chords, then that's all the figured bass you're going to need to know, really. Okay, so I hope it makes sense that figured bass is just really describing the position of the chord, whether or not it's in root position, first inversion, second inversion, or if it's a seventh chord, third inversion. Okay. So there's only one last thing we need to look at for figured bass, and that is chromatic notes. So how would we indicate naturals, sharps, and flats in a chord? Obviously not all chords are just going to be the normal diatonic intervals above the bass note. You may want to indicate a flat or a sharp or a natural in your chord. So it is important to remember then that the numbers in figured bass refer only to the diatonic intervals above the bass note in accordance with the key signature. So what do we do if we want to indicate a natural, sharp, or flat in a chord? And we want to indicate that in the figured bass. Well, say we're in a key signature with 2 flats. If you have a 6/3 written beneath a G in the bass, that tells us that there will be a B flat and an E flat above that G bass note. So just to look at that in the first example here, the very first chord, you see we have a G in the bass and we have 6/3 written underneath, and that would indicate that 6/3 indicates that there's going to be a B flat above that bass, which I've included, I've also included another B flat in that chord just to double it up to make it a full sounding chord. But the 6 also refers to the 6th above that G, which is going to be the E flat. Okay, but say you wanted an E natural. Well, you would have to actually put the natural sign, as you can see in the second chord, next to that 6. That natural sign next to the 6 means that the 6th degree above that G is going to be natural. Okay, it's going to be a natural note. So the 3 above that G is still B flat, and I've just doubled it just to make it a fuller sounding chord. But the E is going to be a 6th above that G, and the natural sign indicates that it is now a natural note. Okay, so if you're not going to be using Roman numerals next to your figured bass, as you can see here, I've just got figured bass but no Roman numerals, you need to then be even more particular. You need to be more detailed in your figured bass writing. You need to indicate every single accidental that occurs in your music. You don't need to do this if you're putting Roman numerals next to your figured bass, as we've already seen in previous slides, because the Roman numerals will already tell you if what the quality of the chord, if it's a major, minor, augmented, or diminished chord. So you don't need to worry about it. But traditionally, figured bass wasn't written next to Roman numerals. So if you had gone back into the Baroque period and looked at a continual part or a keyboard part, it would just have the bass line, just the bass notes, and then the figured bass written above or below it, and that would indicate what chords and what inversions to play above it. So the composer would have to put all these accidentals next to the figured bass, all these natural sharps and flats, to indicate what degrees above the bass note are going to be flat, sharp, or natural. So you can see that in the second example there. That natural next to the 6 means that the 6th degree above G in the bass is going to be natural, and that is the E note. So it's instead of E flat, which is what the key signature would indicate, it's going to be E natural. So let's keep it in the same key and say we have a 6/4 written beneath a C in the bass. That indicates an A and an F are part of the chord. So again, just to take the first chord there in that second example, you have a C in the bass and you have 6/4 written underneath that C, which means you need a 4th and a 6th above that C. I've doubled the C in the tenor part just to make it a fuller sounding chord, and you can see that the 4th above the C is the F and the 6th above the C is the A. But say you wanted an F sharp, in other words, say this is the key of G minor, 2 flats in the key signature and a raised 7th, so you want the F sharp, you would have to put a sharp next to that 4, as you can see I've done that in the second example. So we still have a C in the bass, and you still have a 6th and a 4th above that C, but the 4th is going to be sharpened, so this time it's an F sharp, and the 6th degree above the C, the A, just stays the same. So hopefully that makes sense. As you can see, as I said there, if you're going to be to signify G minor, you need to signify your raised 7ths. Then having accidentals next to figured bass is going to be very, very common in minor keys, because every time you raise your 6th or your 7th, depending on whether or not you're using the harmonic or melodic minor scale, you have to indicate that in the figured bass. Okay, and again, as I said, this is only if you're not using Roman numerals next to your figured bass. So just to continue on with chromatic notes and figured bass, it's important to note that when you write an accidental on its own, in other words, an accidental that's not next to a number, it will always refer to the 3rd above the bass note. So if you write just a sharp as figured bass under your bass note, you're actually saying that you want the 3rd to be sharpened. Okay, so that's something to remember, that accidentals on their own will always refer to the 3rd. And remember that you do not need to write 5/3 as figured bass under chords, because they're so common. Root position chords are so common. So if you wanted to say that a chord is in root position but you want the 3rd of that chord to be sharpened, the only thing you'd have to do in your figured bass is just write a sharp. That's it. Not even next to any numbers, just a sharp. So that sharp implies a sharpened 3rd, and it also implies a 5/3 chord with a sharpened 3rd. And say you're looking for a first inversion chord, you would write your 6 with the sharp underneath. And again, that would, as you can see there, that equals a 6 with a sharpened 3rd. So Accidentals on their own will always refer just to the third above the bass note. It's just a convention. You don't need to know why this is. It's just something that's very common in figure bass. So it's only really going to be next to like 6 or 5 or 4 or other numbers where you actually have to write the sharp, flat, or natural next to those numbers. You don't have to do that for the third. You can just write it the accidental on its own. These chromatic alterations usually occur in modulations and frequently in minor keys. So again, if you're not using Roman numerals and you're just using figured bass to analyze a piece, it's going to be very common that you're going to need to use sharps, flats, and naturals next to those numbers, especially when you're modulating or you're in a minor key. And this will frequently occur on the tonic, the subdominant, and the dominant. They're going to be the most likely affected chords, and they can either be major or minor chords depending on the context. So let's have a look at a piece of music that's actually in the key of A minor. And as you can see, the very first chord in bar 1 is an ACE chord with the A at the bottom. So it's a root position chord, it's a 5-3 chord, but remember in figured bass we can abbreviate that to nothing because they're so common, so we don't need to write 5-3. And the line which follows that means that that chord lasts over the next couple of beats until you hit the next figured bass indication. So that chord actually lasts for the entire length of the first bar at ACE continues. Even though the bass note jumps an octave, it's still really just an ACE chord. And then the first chord in the second bar is a first inversion chord. It's an EGB chord with the G at the bottom. And again, we indicate that in the figured bass of a 6. But remember, 6 is the abbreviated version of 6-3. So it's really the third and the sixth above that G. So the third above the G is your B, and the sixth above the G is the E. And as you can see, that continues on for the next couple of beats as well for bar 2. So again, you just draw a line from the 6 until the next bar, until the next change in figured bass basically. And on the third bar in the first beat, you've got an FAC chord with the F at the bottom. So again, it's a root position chord, so you don't need to write 5-3 in the figured bass, you can just abbreviate it to nothing. And the very last beat on that bar is a DFA chord. So that is a second inversion, or sorry, a first inversion because the F's in the bass. So the F has lasted the entire length of that bar. And again, you don't need to write 6-3 for first inversion, you can just abbreviate it to 6. The 3 is always implied. And then we get to the chromatic alterations in our figure bass. The first beat in bar 4 is an EGB chord. Even though the B is missing, you only really need, for chords, you only really need your root, and your third. Okay, the fifth can actually be dropped. So you have your root there. In fact, the root is doubled. You have 2 E's, and you have the third, which is a G sharp. So you want to indicate that sharpened third in the bass. And remember, a sharp on its own refers to the sharpened third. And you don't need to write anything else for the chord because it's a root position chord. So again, remember 5-3 can be abbreviated to nothing. So all you need to write in the figured bass for that first chord in bar 4 is a sharp. And for the second beat, it's actually an EGB D chord, so it's a 7th chord with the D in the bass. And again, that's third inversion, so you could write that as 6-4-2 or just 4-2. It's the abbreviated version, which is what I've done. Gives you a bit more room to work with as well. So yeah, 4-2 is the abbreviated version. But the fourth above that D, D, E, F, G, so it's going to be the G above that D, needs to be sharpened because it's continued over from the previous chord. So you need to put a sharp next to that 4. And the very last chord on bar 4 is a first inversion chord, an ACE chord with the C at the bottom. Okay, so you only need to write 6. You can write 6-3, but it's more popular just as you can see from the previous 2 first inversion chords, it's just more popular to write 6. And then the last 3 chords of this exercise, you can actually see it's a D, F sharp A chord, E, G sharp B chord, and A, C sharp E chord. So you have 3 chords, which is really your subdominant, your dominant to your tonic chord. Very common 4-5-1 ending for chord progressions. Each one of those chords is a major chord, and each one of them has a sharpened third. So you have a D, F sharp, A chord. So you need to indicate the F above that D is a sharpened F. In other words, it's a third above D, but it's going to be a sharpened third. So you just need to put the sharp in the figured bass. Again, you don't need to write anything else because it's a root position chord. The 5-3 is implied. Okay. Same thing goes actually for the next chord, which is your E, G, B chord. Again, the third is going to be sharpened, so you need that G to be sharpened, so you just need to write sharp in the figured bass, and again you don't need to write anything else because the 5-3 is implied. And then the very last chord you have an A, C sharp, E chord, and again you need to put a sharp in the figured bass to indicate that that third, that C, is going to be a sharp. Okay, so each one of those is a major chord, and as you can see, because this is a minor piece, you have so many raised notes. Obviously you'll have your raised seventh, you may even have your raised sixth as you do with your F sharp, and in some cases as well, especially for Baroque music, you actually have what you call a tierce de Picardy. You end on a major tonic chord rather than a minor one. So that's C sharp in the very last chord. It's quite common to do that actually. So you've begun the piece in A minor, so you have an A, C, E chord at the beginning, but then you end the piece on what's an A major chord, essentially, an A, C sharp, E chord. That's called tierce de Picardy. It's quite common in Baroque periods. And it only really happens in minor keys, so you'd never start a major piece and end on a minor chord, but you can start a minor piece and end on a major chord. So as you can see, when you're dealing with minor pieces, the figured bass can get quite complicated, especially if you're not using Roman numerals. You need to indicate every single accidental that's in the music, and that requires a lot of accurate and detailed indications in your figured bass. So just to finish up, so far I've been showing you the last couple of slides about figured bass without Roman numerals, but notice that if you are going to use Roman numerals with figured bass, which is a far more accurate, in my opinion, a far more accurate analysis of the music, then you do not need to use accidentals in the figured bass. Okay, so if you're using Roman numerals with figured bass, you do not need to use accidentals, and I'll show you why. The main reason actually is because Roman numerals will already suggest any accidentals by telling you if the chord is major, minor, augmented, or diminished. So we're going to look at the exact same piece that we've just saw in the last slide. We've just looked at in the last slide. And I'm just going to go through it now with Roman numerals and figured bass to show you how the figured bass will change when you're using it with Roman numerals. So this is probably what we want you to do in this course more often than not, is to use your analysis Roman numerals with figured bass. So luckily for you guys, you don't have to worry too much about putting in all those accidentals everywhere. But bearing in mind, if you ever do come across a question that asks you just for the figured bass and no Roman numerals, then you have to be very careful to make sure that when you come to a modulation, or if you're in a minor key, that you indicate all those altered notes or all the raised sixths and sevenths or any tierce de Picardy chords, things like that. So just be very careful. So here is what this piece will look like now with Roman numerals and figured bass together. And as you can see, probably the most obvious change, well for me the most obvious change is if you look at the last two bars, you have those chords 4, 5, 1, again very common chord progression, 4, 5, 1 to end a phrase or end a piece of music. But each one of those chords is a major chord, so they're capital Roman numerals. That's why you do not need to put any sharps in the figured bass. First of all, you don't even need to write any 5-3 figured bass indications under those chords, because remember 5-3 is abbreviated to nothing. For root position chords, you don't have to write any figured bass, and you do not need to put in the sharpened figured bass indications either, because the fact that those Roman numerals are capital already tells you that they're major chords. So the D, F sharp A is a major chord, so you make it a capital Roman numeral. The E, G sharp B is a major chord, so you make that a capital Roman numeral. And the A, C sharp E is a major chord, so you make it a capital Roman numeral. So notice the difference then in the Roman numerals between the very first chord and the very last chord. One's a lowercase Roman numeral and the other one's a capital Roman numeral. So that's why you don't need to use accidentals in your figured bass when you're using them with Roman numerals. So again, just to go through it, you can see the very first chord is a lowercase tonic chord, and that lasts to the end of the bar. I just color coordinated them here to show you the difference between the majors and the minors, I suppose. Then you have a lowercase Roman numeral dominant chord, and then you need to put a 6 next to it to say that it's in first inversion. Then you get to your capital submediant chord, your 6th chord, which is an FAC chord. Then you get to your lowercase subdominant chord, or your lower Roman numerals subdominant chord with a 6 next to it to indicate that it's a first inversion chord. And then you get to your major chords, your major chord, your major dominant chord, your EGB chord. Again, the B's not there, but the fifth doesn't need to be part of the chord, as long as you have your root and your third. So there's your EGB chord, and again you capitalize it to show that it's a major chord. So again, you don't need to put in any sharps in your figure bass. So you don't even need to put in the 5-3 to indicate that it's in root position, and you do not need to put in the sharp to indicate that the third is sharpened, because the fact that the Roman numeral is a capital Roman numeral will already tell you the quality of the chord. And the same goes for the rest of it, I suppose. So that's what those last couple of sentences, those last couple of lines on that slide mean. It's an A minor, so the F and the G, the 6th and 7th degrees, can be sharpened if ascending, which can change a minor subdominant and dominant chords to major subdominant and dominant chords. And chord 1 can also become a major chord 1 at cadences, in other words, your tierce to Picardy chords. Okay. So a lot to take in that last slide, but hopefully it makes sense that if you have Roman numerals and figure bass together, not only do you get a more accurate description in your analysis, but you don't have to worry so much about putting accidentals into your figure bass, because the Roman numerals will take care of that information for you. So that's basically it for lesson 2, guys. There was a lot in this lesson. I know we were dealing a lot with quite a lot of new material, especially if you're not used to figured bass. Most of this will be quite new to you. If you need any additional help, or if you want to get in contact with me through the website, or you have my work email address, that's fine. Or you want to meet up and discuss anything, that's fine as well. So please get in contact with me if you need any extra help with this. But read over the material, read over the handouts, try a few of the exercises, and read up on it as well. And if it all is getting too much for you and it still doesn't make sense, please do get in contact with me, because you're going to be using figured bass from now until the end of the course, basically. So you need to be quite familiar with your root position figure bass, which is usually abbreviated to nothing. Your first inversion figure bass, which can be a 6 or a 6-3, but it's usually just abbreviated to 6. Your second inversion figure bass, which is a 6-4, you can't abbreviate it to anything, so you do need to write it out in full. And all the 7th chords as well for your figured bass. Your 7, which indicates a root position 7th chord. Your 6-5, which indicates a first inversion 7th chord. Your 4-3, which indicates a second inversion 7th chord, and your 4-2, which indicates a third inversion 7th chord. And you can actually see an example of it in this exercise. The dominant chord with a 7th, but it's in third inversion. Okay. So please get in contact with me if you need any additional help.